My father, Frank Calloway, standing at the head of the main table with a beer in one hand and the particular confidence of a man who has never once been told his opinions were anything other than welcome. Someone asked what everyone was up to these days. When it got to me, when my name entered the conversation, Frank looked around the table with that easy, familiar smile and said, "Nora, she's the one who dropped out. No degree, no real direction, uneducated, and honestly, worthless in a job market like this one." He shrugged. "But what are you going to do?" 22 people laughed. 8 went quiet. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I set my fork down on the table, looked directly at my father, and said 4 words, "Remember this moment, Dad." Then I stood up, picked up my bag, and walked to my car. Nobody came after me. Nobody called that night. That was 3 years ago. What happened in those 3 years is exactly why I'm here. Before I take you back, hit subscribe and like this video, but only if you genuinely want to know how this ends. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Now let me take you back, because this story didn't start in that backyard. It started a long time before that, and it goes a whole lot deeper than one sentence at a family reunion. My name is Nora Calloway. I am 29 years old. I grew up in Brentwood, Tennessee, in a 4-bedroom house on a street where every lawn was manicured and every car in the driveway said something about the family inside. My father, Frank, had spent 30 years as a plant operations manager for a mid-sized manufacturing company. Long hours, decent money, the kind of career that builds a man's identity so thoroughly that he becomes unable to separate what he does from who he is. In Frank Calloway's world, your value was measured in credentials, your degree, your title, your annual salary, and whether the people at the table nodded when you said where you worked. If you had those things, you were worth talking to. If you didn't, you were a cautionary tale he referenced at dinner to motivate the people who did. My mother, Sandra, was a woman who had built her entire emotional survival strategy around keeping Frank Calloway comfortable. She was warm. She was capable. She was the person who remembered every birthday and organized every holiday and kept the house running with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided early in her marriage that her job was to smooth every surface so nothing ever got too rough. She loved me in the way that people love things they are afraid to fully defend, completely, but privately, never in a room where it might cost her anything. That distinction mattered more than I knew how to articulate when I was growing up. It took me years to find the right words for it. The word, I eventually decided, was conditional. Her love was real. Her protection was conditional on Frank's approval of what she was protecting. My brother Tyler was 31, 2 years older than me, and he was the version of success my father had spent his whole parenting career trying to produce. Finance degree from Vanderbilt, a director-level position at Cumberland Valley Financial, one of the larger regional banks in Middle Tennessee, a house in a good zip code, a wife named Amber, who had the kind of smooth social competence that made her seem warm at family gatherings while she was quietly assessing everyone in the room and filing the assessments for later use. Tyler wasn't cruel the way cruelty looks in movies. He was the kind of person who benefited from a system without examining it, who had been handed so many advantages so consistently that he had come to mistake the advantages for personal merit. He wasn't against me. He was just never really for me either. And in a family with my particular dynamics, the difference between those two things was not as wide as it should have been. Amber. Let me tell you about Amber. She had a gift. And I use that word deliberately because it genuinely requires skill for delivering the cutting remark inside something that looked like a compliment. Nora, you always look so effortlessly casual, meant you could have tried harder. I think it's so brave to just do your own thing, meant she'd already decided my thing was not impressive. She said things at family gatherings that landed and then disappeared before you could point to them, leaving you holding an injury with nothing to show for it. I had spent years nodding and smiling and letting those comments go because making a scene was not something I was willing to do in my father's house. That restraint had a cost. Most restraint does. Uncle Gene was my mother's older brother, 58, quiet, the kind of man who listened at the edge of every gathering and only spoke when he had something worth saying. He had been a high school drafting teacher for 26 years and had the particular quality of people who work with young people their whole lives. He could see what someone was built for before they knew themselves. He was the one person in my family who had ever looked at me and asked what I actually wanted to do with my life, rather than what I was going to do about the fact that I wasn't doing what Frank Calloway expected. He called me sometimes just to check in without an agenda. Those calls were some of the most sustaining things in my life during the years I am about to tell you about. I need to tell you about the decision that started everything, because the family reunion was not where this began. It was where it became undeniable. But the root of it goes back to when I was 20 years old and a sophomore at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, double majoring in graphic design and communications, carrying a 3.7 GPA and an application for a competitive design residency program in Chicago that I had been working on for 6 weeks. I was happy in the specific, focused way I had only ever been happy when I was working on something that felt genuinely mine. I was good at design, not in the way people say they are good at things when they want to believe it, but in the measurable, concrete way. Professors referencing my projects in class, peers asking for feedback, a small freelance portfolio that was already generating occasional paid work. I was building something. I could feel it the way you can feel the shape of a thing before it's fully visible. Frank called me home on a Saturday in October. Not a suggestion, a directive. Family meeting, he said over the phone, which in the Calloway house had never once meant anything comfortable. I drove 3 hours from Knoxville to Brentwood and arrived to find my parents in the kitchen and Tyler on the couch with the particular ease of someone who already knew what was going to be said. My father sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten 10,000 dinners, and explained, in the organized, systematic way he explained everything, that he had done the math on the family finances, and the numbers did not support 2 college tuitions simultaneously. Tyler had been accepted into a graduate finance program at Belmont University. It was, Frank said, a significant opportunity. Something had to give. That something, it had already been decided before I walked through the door, was going to be me. He said he was proud of my work at UT, but that design wasn't a stable field, that the job market was unpredictable, that I could always go back later when things were more settled. He said Tyler's career would benefit the whole family. He said it with the confidence of a man who believed completely in the fairness of what he was proposing. Sandra sat beside him and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Tyler did not look at me. I remember staring at the center of the kitchen table for several seconds at a small scratch in the wood I had made when I was 9, dragging a fork across it by accident, and thinking, this is not a conversation. This is an announcement. The decision has been made. I am here to receive it. I said, you told me you'd pay for my education. You said that when I chose UT, Frank said circumstances changed. Tyler's opportunity was time-sensitive. Mine could wait. I asked how long I was expected to wait. He said until things settled down. I asked what that meant specifically. He didn't answer that directly. He said he believed in me and that I was resourceful and that I would figure it out. That sentence, I believe in you, you'll figure it out, is one of the most convenient things a person can say when they are choosing not to help you. It has the shape of support and the substance of a door closing in your face. I nodded. I did not argue further. I drove back to Knoxville, finished the semester, and did not re-enroll in January. I never told anyone about the Chicago residency application. I deleted it from my desktop the night I got home. What happened next is the part people don't usually ask about because the interesting story seems like it starts later, the success, the reversal, the moment of reckoning. But this is the part one wants you to stay with because this is where the real story is. I moved to Nashville at 21 with $2,000, a laptop that was already 2 years old, and a suitcase of clothes that didn't fit the life I was about to need to build. I got a room in a shared house in East Nashville, 4 people, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that was perpetually either too clean or completely destroyed with no middle ground. I got a job as a receptionist at a small marketing firm. Entry level, 41 hours a week, health insurance that I was genuinely grateful for. I answered phones and organized calendars and smiled at clients and said thank you when people held doors. At night, I opened my laptop. I had been building design skills since I was 16, and the 2 years at UT had sharpened them considerably, but what I had now that I hadn't had before was desperation, which is, it turns out, one of the more effective creative accelerants available. I took every free course I could find: interaction design, user research methodology, visual systems, product design fundamentals. I rebuilt my portfolio from scratch with self-initiated projects, designing interfaces for apps that didn't exist, yet just to have something to show. I took on my first paid freelance project for a friend's food blog, $150 for a full visual rebrand, and I delivered it like it was worth 10 times that because I understood, even then, that the work you do when nobody is watching sets the standard for everything that comes after it. I did not tell my family what I was doing. That choice was deliberate, and it was not made from shame. It was made from the cold, clear calculation of someone who had learned that in her particular family, an incomplete success was more dangerous than a secret one. If I told Frank I was freelancing, he would ask how much I was making, and when the number was small, as it was at first, he would use it to confirm the story he already believed. I was not going to hand him that ammunition before I had something bulletproof to replace it with. So I kept my head down. I kept working. I kept the secret of Pinnacle Studio the way you keep a fire going in the wind, with both hands cupped around it turned away from the direction the air was coming from. The first real client, a real one, not a friend's blog or a favor, came through a referral 14 months after I started freelancing. A small tech startup in the Gulch neighborhood of Nashville needed a full product interface design for their mobile app. They had a developer, they had funding, they had a concept, but they had nothing that looked like it was built by people who had thought about the user's experience with any seriousness. I quoted them a number that felt terrifying, and they said yes without negotiating. I worked on that project for 9 weeks. When I delivered it, the founder sent me an email that I have saved in a folder I have never deleted. It said, "This is the first time our product has looked like it was built by someone who actually cared whether people could use it. Thank you." I read that email 4 times. Then I opened a new project file. There was more work to do. The East Nashville house had a kitchen where someone always left the coffee maker on too long, and a backyard that never quite dried out after rain, and 4 people living lives so different from each other that the only thing they really shared was the thin walls between their rooms. I am telling you these details because I think the texture of where you build something matters. I did not build Pinnacle Studio in a sleek co-working space with exposed brick and artisanal pour-over coffee. I built the earliest version of it in a rented room with a space heater that clicked every 40 seconds and a neighbor who watched competitive cooking shows at 11 at night and turned the volume up during the judging segments. That is the real version. The version without the aesthetics of ambition, just the substance of it. I want you to have that version because I think it is the truer and more useful one. I want to be honest with you about those early years because I think there is a version of this kind of story that gets told too cleanly, where the protagonist is just grinding away confidently, completely sure of where she's going, moving through the difficulty with a kind of serene determination that makes it look easier than it was. That was not my experience. There were nights when I sat at my laptop in that East Nashville room and felt the specific loneliness of building something in a vacuum with no one in my family to call, no one to share the small wins with, no safety net under any of it. When a project went well, I celebrated alone. When a project went sideways, I fixed it alone. When I was tired, I got up anyway because the rent was due regardless of how I felt. I am telling you this not because I want your sympathy, but because I think the honest version of a comeback story includes the nights when you were not sure you were coming back at all and you kept going anyway. There is a specific quality of loneliness that belongs to building something in secret, not the loneliness of being alone, which is clean and navigable, but the loneliness of being surrounded by people who have decided what you are while you are quietly becoming something else entirely. That was the texture of the 18 months between leaving the marketing firm and landing the first real client. I would have conversations with my family, the occasional obligatory phone call, a holiday dinner I could not avoid. And the entire time I was sitting at their table or talking into their receiver, I was carrying something they did not know existed. A studio with no clients yet. A portfolio being built in the dark. A bet placed on myself with no one else's buy-in. Those conversations had a particular exhaustion to them, not because the people were terrible, but because I was performing a version of myself that was already out of date, the drifting daughter, the uncertain one, the one who had not yet figured it out, while the person I was actually becoming was waiting quietly in an East Nashville apartment for the work to prove her real. I did not resent the secrecy. I want to be clear about that. I had chosen it deliberately, and I maintained it deliberately, and the discipline of it taught me something I could not have learned any other way, that you can know your own worth before anyone else confirms it, and that knowledge held long enough and worked towards seriously enough becomes a kind of bedrock. I stopped needing Frank Calloway to see me correctly in order to know that I was something. That shift, internal, unremarkable from the outside, enormous in its consequences, was the most important thing that happened to me in those 18 months. Not the first client, not the studio registration. The moment I stopped waiting for the validation and started working as if it had already arrived. I registered Pinnacle Studio as an LLC 22 months after I started freelancing. I remember sitting in the Tennessee Secretary of State's online filing portal at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, entering the company name and my information and feeling something shift inside me when the confirmation email came through. Not excitement exactly, something quieter and more durable than excitement. Something that felt like ownership, like I had named a thing that had been real for a while, but had not yet had a name, and the naming made it permanent. I put the confirmation email in the same folder as the startup founder's note. These were my records, not of success exactly, not yet, but of the process of becoming something. I kept them the way you keep documents that prove you exist. The family reunion happened 26 months after I registered the studio. Pinnacle had 4 active clients by then, all referral-based, all small to mid-sized businesses who had found me through someone who had worked with me before. I was making more than I had made at any previous job. Not wildly, not yet, but consistently with a trajectory that was pointing somewhere real. I had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Germantown with a proper second room I used as a studio, 2 monitors, a drawing tablet, reference books organized by category, a corkboard of active project briefs. The apartment had good natural light in the mornings and a coffee shop 3 blocks away where I did client calls when I needed to get out of my own head. It was mine. Every inch of it. Mine. I went to the reunion because not going would have been its own statement, and I was not ready to make that statement yet. I wore a white linen dress and drove my used Honda Civic. Nothing showy, nothing that would invite questions I wasn't ready to answer publicly. I helped Sandra set out the side dishes when I arrived. I talked to Uncle Gene near the back fence for 20 minutes about a documentary he was watching, and it was the easiest conversation I had all day. I ate Tyler's wife Amber's pasta salad and told her it was delicious, which I mentioned because I want you to understand that I was not sitting in that backyard coiled and waiting for something to happen. I was genuinely trying to have a normal afternoon with my family. That is what makes what happened next particularly instructive. You can want a normal afternoon with your family. You can do everything right, and your family can still be exactly what it is. The conversation started the way those conversations start, organically, harmlessly, someone asking what everyone was up to these days. Tyler talked about the bank expansion his branch was leading. Amber mentioned a renovation project on their house. Cousins talked about their kids. The whole gentle performance of a family that is doing well, passing the baton around the table. When it got to me, when someone looked in my direction and the expectation of an answer hung in the air, I started to say something, I opened my mouth, and Frank spoke first. He had been drinking his third beer. He wasn't drunk. Frank Calloway was never sloppy. That wasn't his style. He was the kind of man who got more precise as the evening went on, more certain of his own authority. He looked around the table with that loose, easy smile of his and said, "Nora, she's the one who dropped out. No degree, no real direction, uneducated, and honestly, worthless in a job market like this one." He shrugged and took a sip. "But what are you going to do?" 22 people laughed. Actual laughter, not mean-spirited exactly, but the laugh of people who have been given permission by the authority at the head of the table to find something funny, and who take it without stopping to check if it's actually a joke or something else. 8 people went quiet. Uncle Gene was one of the 8. He was looking at me from across the table with an expression that was not pity. Gene never looked at me with pity, but something closer to a man bracing for impact, who is hoping the impact lands somewhere it can be survived. I sat with that sentence for exactly 4 seconds. I counted them. Or rather, I experienced them the way you experience time when something has slowed everything down, each second distinct, separate, fully present. In those 4 seconds, I felt the full range of what was moving through me. The heat of humiliation, the cold flash of anger, the older and deeper grief of a woman who had been waiting on some level for this particular confirmation of how little space she had ever been given in this family's story. I felt all of it, and then I set my fork down on the table. Quietly, not dramatically, just the small, definitive sound of a utensil placed with intention. I looked at my father. I did not look at the 22 people who had laughed. I did not look at Sandra, who was looking at her plate. I did not look at Tyler, who was looking at his beer. I looked directly at Frank Calloway, and I said, clearly and without any tremor in my voice, "Remember this moment, Dad." That was all. 4 words. I stood up, picked up my bag from the back of my chair, and walked through the backyard toward the gate. My sandals on the grass were quiet. The fireflies were still out. Nobody came after me. I got into my Honda, pulled out of the driveway, and drove the 40 minutes back to Germantown with the windows down and the radio off, letting the July night air do whatever it could with what I was carrying. My apartment was dark when I got home. I turned on the lamp in the studio, sat down at my desk, and looked at the active project boards pinned to my corkboard, a brand identity system for a restaurant group in East Nashville, a mobile app interface for a property management startup, a digital marketing platform redesign for a healthcare consulting firm. Work that was real, work that clients had hired me to do because it was good enough to hire, work that existed in the world and was making businesses function better than they had before I touched them. I sat with all of that for a long time. Then I opened a new document and wrote myself 1 line at the top of an otherwise blank page. Build it until there is no argument left to make. I saved the document. I went to bed. I slept, if not peacefully, then at least with the particular steadiness that comes from knowing exactly what you are going to do when you wake up. I did not call my parents the next day or the day after. I called Uncle Gene on a Sunday, 10 days after the reunion. He answered immediately, which told me he had been waiting. He said, "I'm sorry about what happened, Nora." I said I knew. He said he had wanted to say something at the table and hadn't, and that he was sorry for that too. I said I appreciated him saying so. He said, "You keep building what you're building. Don't let that man's limitations become yours." I said I wasn't planning on it. We talked for 40 minutes about other things, a book he was reading, a hiking trail he'd done near Chattanooga. When we hung up, I sat at my desk and got back to work. Time, when you are using it properly, has a way of compressing. The 12 months that followed the reunion were the most productive of my professional life to that point. I brought on 2 freelance collaborators, a motion designer named Keisha and a brand strategist named Paul, and the 3 of us functioned as a small, efficient team that could take on the kind of scope that I couldn't manage alone. Pinnacle Studios' revenue crossed $400,000 for the year. That number felt surreal when I saw it in the accounting software for the first time. I sat with it for a moment, and then I updated my rates and kept going because the number was real, but it was also just a number. And the thing that mattered was the next project, the next brief, the next chance to do something better than the last thing. I met Eli Okafor at a client presentation in the spring. He was a data analyst working on the analytics infrastructure for an app one was designing the interface for, brought in by the same startup. He had an unhurried quality that I noticed immediately, the kind of person who takes in information before responding to it, who asks follow-up questions because he is actually curious rather than performing curiosity. We got coffee after the project wrapped and talked for 2 hours without either of us planning to. He did not ask me what my 5-year plan was. He asked what I was most excited about in the work I was doing right now. That question, so specific, so present tense, told me something about who he was that the 5-year plan version never could have. Over the following months, he became the kind of presence in my life that makes the hard parts easier without ever trying to take them over. He was consistent. He showed up. In a season where I had learned not to expect those things, they meant more than I knew how to say at the time. The call from Cumberland Valley Financial came on a Tuesday morning in early October, 16 months after the reunion. I was at my desk reviewing typography options for a healthcare client when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Renata Torres, VP of Marketing at Cumberland Valley Financial. She said they were undergoing a full digital transformation, new platform, new mobile experience, complete visual overhaul, and they were looking for a design partner to lead the project. They had reviewed several portfolios, and Pinnacle Studios' work had come through a referral from a mutual contact. She asked if I would be available for a discovery call that week. I said yes. I was professional and composed. I set a time. I ended the call. And then I typed Cumberland Valley Financial Nashville into my browser, and I sat very still while the search results loaded. Their website, their branch locations, their leadership page, and their under regional operations and branch management with a headshot and a title that confirmed everything. Tyler Calloway, Finance Director, Cumberland Valley Financial, Nashville Metro Region. My brother, his company, his bank had found me. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because the honest version is more interesting than the clean one. There was a flicker of something that felt very much like satisfaction, the specific, quiet satisfaction of a person who has been building in private for years and has just watched the private thing arrive uninvited in a public room. I will not pretend that flicker wasn't there, but it passed quickly. What settled underneath, it was something more level and more important. I had not arranged this. I had not engineered it. I had built Pinnacle Studio as well as I knew how to build it, and the work had moved through networks I hadn't tracked until it arrived here. That was not strategy. That was consequence. And I had learned in 3 years of watching how work actually moves through the world, that consequence is more powerful and more lasting than any plan you could construct because you can't fake your way to it. You can only earn it. I took the discovery call. I did not mention Tyler. I presented as a professional who had done her research on the company's existing digital presence, which I had, and who understood the scope and strategic context of what they were trying to accomplish, which I did. Renata Torres was sharp and direct, the kind of executive who has sat through enough bad presentations to have a very low threshold for vagueness, and who responds to specificity the way a plant responds to actual sunlight. We clicked in the way that sometimes happens when two people are operating at the same frequency. She said she wanted to move forward with a formal proposal. I said I would have one to her within the week. I spent 7 days on that proposal. It was the most thorough document Pinnacle Studio had produced to that point. User research framework, competitive landscape analysis, a phased project timeline with specific deliverables at each stage, sample visual direction concepts to give them a feel for where the work might go. I had Keisha and Paul review every section. I revised it twice. When I submitted it, I knew it was the best proposal I had ever written, not because of who would read it, but because the project deserved it, and so did my team. Cumberland Valley Financial signed the contract 11 days later. The project was valued at $2.1 million over 18 months. It was the largest contract Pinnacle Studio had ever held. Tyler found out his company had hired Pinnacle Studio 3 weeks into the project. I know this because he called me, not a text, an actual phone call on a Thursday evening. I was in my studio reviewing the first round of wireframes when his name appeared on my screen. I looked at it for a moment. Then I answered. He said, "Nora." I said, "Tyler." There was a pause that had a lot of architecture inside it. He said, "I just found out who runs Pinnacle Studio." I said, "Okay." Another pause. He said, "Renata Torres showed me the portfolio at our leadership briefing today. She had no idea. She said, 'Tyler, your sister is behind Pinnacle. Did you know that?' And he stopped. I waited. He said, 'I didn't know, Nora. I didn't know any of it.' I said, 'I know you didn't.' He said, 'How long has this been going on?' I said, 3 years of real operation. About 5 years total of building toward it." He was quiet. I heard him exhale. He said, "Renata called it the smartest design approach she'd seen from any firm they'd reviewed." I said, "I know. She told me." Another silence. Then Tyler said, "I owe you something I don't know how to say." I said, "You don't have to say it tonight, but you should say it eventually." He called back 4 days later and said it, not in a big speech. Tyler is not a speech kind of person, which is one of the things about him that is genuinely decent. He said, "I let Dad's opinion be my picture of you. I never looked for a different one. That wasn't fair, and it wasn't right, and I'm sorry. I sat with that sentence for a moment. I said, "Thank you for saying that clearly." He said, "Are you going to tell him?" I said, "When the time is right." He said he needs to know. I said, "I know." We did not have a warm, tearful reconciliation. What we had was more valuable, an honest conversation between two adults who had, for the first time, spoken to each other without the interference of a decades-old family script. That was the beginning of something real. I did not know yet exactly how it would grow, but I could feel that it was a beginning. Frank found out in December. The way it happened was not cinematic. There was no staged reveal, no dramatic confrontation at another family gathering. It happened because Tyler told him. He sat down with Frank on a Saturday morning and explained systematically and clearly that the firm leading Cumberland Valley Financial's $2.1 million digital transformation was Pinnacle Studio, owned and operated by his daughter Nora, who had been building it for 5 years without any support or acknowledgement from this family. I know what Tyler told him, because Tyler called me afterward and relayed the conversation in detail. He said Frank had gone very quiet, that he had asked several clarifying questions. What exactly the firm did, how large the contract was, how long it had been running, the questions of a man who processes surprise through information gathering, because direct emotional response is not available to him. Tyler said at one point Frank had put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a long time without saying anything. Frank called me the following Monday. It was the kind of phone call that starts with small things because the real thing is too large to walk into directly. He asked how I was. I said I was well. He asked about the weather in Nashville. I said it had been cold. And then, after a pause that had the weight of several years inside it, he said, "Tyler told me about the company." I said, "I know he did." He said, $2.1 million. Not a question. The repetition of a number that had not yet fully settled into his understanding. I said, "Yes." He said, "You did that yourself." I said, "I did." Another pause. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "You weren't meant to." "Not yet." He said, "Why not?" And here is where I told him the truth, the way I had been waiting for 3 years to tell it, not with anger, not with performance, but with the clear and steady voice of someone who has had enough time with the truth that it no longer shakes her to say it out loud. I said, because in this family, frank and incomplete success is more dangerous than no success at all. I knew that if I told you I was building something and you looked at it before it was finished, you would find what was missing rather than what was there. I needed it to be finished first. I needed it to be undeniable, because you have spent my entire life deciding what I was worth before I had a chance to show you, and I was not going to give you another opportunity to make that mistake. The line was quiet. I continued. What you said at the reunion this summer, in front of 30 people, in front of cousins I grew up with, in front of neighbors who've known me my whole life, that was not a joke. It was what you believed. And I need you to understand that it was wrong. Not because I turned out to be successful, because it was wrong when you said it. It was wrong when you pulled my tuition to fund Tyler's program. It was wrong every time you looked through me like I wasn't there. The company doesn't make it wrong retroactively. It was always wrong. Silence. A long, complete silence. Then Frank Calloway said, in a voice that was quieter than I had ever heard from him, "You're right." 2 words. Just that. I am right. He knew it and he said it, and I believe he meant it, which is more than I had ever expected from him and less than I had deserved all along. And I was able to hold both of those things at once without needing to resolve them into something cleaner. He came to Nashville in February. Just him. Sandra stayed home, which was a choice I did not examine too closely, because some reckonings need to happen in pairs before they happen in larger groups. He came to the Pinnacle studio office, a second-floor space in a converted building in the Gulch, exposed brick, 12-foot ceilings, the kind of room that announces itself before you've had a chance to announce yourself. Keisha and Paul were both in that day. I introduced him simply. "This is my father, Frank." He shook their hands. He looked around the office, at the work on the walls, the client project boards, the monitors, the organized evidence of an operation that was genuinely, unmistakably real. He did not say much. He stood at the window for a while and looked out at the street below. At some point he said, quietly, almost to himself, "You built this." I said, "Yes." He turned around. He looked at me the way someone looks when they are seeing something they should have looked at a long time ago and are trying to make up for the missed years in a single act of attention. He said, "I'm proud of you, Nora." The words were late. They were real. I let them land without rushing to decide what they meant for everything that had come before them. Pinnacle Studio is in its 4th year now, 9 full-time employees, and a roster of clients that would have seemed impossible to the woman who sat at a shared house kitchen table in East Nashville with a 2-year-old laptop and a ramen budget. The Cumberland Valley Financial Project wrapped 6 months ago to strong reviews. Renata Torres sent Pinnacle a handwritten thank you note, which I have framed in the office not because I need the validation, but because it represents the kind of work I am most proud of. Complex, specific, built with care, unmistakably ours. Tyler and I have dinner when he's in the Gulch area, which happens more often than it used to. He is learning slowly to separate his own assessments from the ones he inherited from Frank. That is harder work than it sounds. I give him credit for doing it. Eli and I moved into a house together in March, a 2-story in Germantown with a studio on the upper floor and a back porch where I drink my morning coffee and watch the neighborhood come awake. He makes eggs on Sunday mornings and has an opinion about every Nashville restaurant that opens and is in the quiet and daily ways that matter the most consistently decent person I have ever known. He does not tell me my story is inspiring. He just knows what it cost and treats the cost with respect. That is its own kind of love, and it is the kind I needed most. I want to tell you about the moment I understood that the reversal was complete, not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet, private recognition that arrived on an ordinary afternoon. It was a Wednesday in November, 3 months after the Cumberland Valley contract signed. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the project's first phase deliverables before sending them to Renata Torres for client review. Keisha was at her desk across the room. Paul was on a call in the conference area, outside the Gulch office windows. The afternoon light was doing that particular November thing where it goes gold and then gray in the span of 20 minutes. I had a cup of coffee going cold beside my keyboard. I looked at the work on my screen, clean, specific, genuinely excellent, the best version of what this project could be. And I thought about my father standing at the head of that July table with a beer in his hand saying uneducated and worthless. And I thought about the 14th-floor conference room where Renata Torres had looked at a presentation with Pinnacle Studios' name on it and said out loud in front of a room full of people, "Whoever runs this firm is exactly the kind of thinker we needed on this." And I thought, there it is. Not revenge, not vindication, just the truth arrived. 4 seconds at the reunion table, and then 3 years of work, and then the truth arrived in a conference room my brother sat in, carrying my name, in a voice that required no argument. I picked up my cold coffee, and I drank it, and I sent the deliverables to Renata, and I got back to work. Frank, and I talk on the phone every 2 or 3 weeks. The conversations are not the warm, easy calls I always wanted from my father when I was young. They are more careful than that, more honest, built on the cleared ground of what was said in December rather than on the comfortable fiction of a family that was always fine. He has not made a joke at my expense since the reunion. He has not offered his opinion on my career or my choices without being asked. He is trying, in the way that men of his particular generation and disposition try, imperfectly, without a clear template, with more self-consciousness than he would admit. I am trying too. I am trying to let what is happening now be real without asking it to also retroactively fix what happened then. Those are 2 different things, and keeping them separate is ongoing work. Sandra told me she was proud of me in a text last month. The text was 2 sentences. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I'm proud of you, Nora. And I'm sorry I wasn't braver when you needed me to be." I sat with those 2 sentences for a long time before I replied. I wrote back, "Thank you for saying that, Mom. It means something." It did. Late things can still be real. They land differently than they would have at the right time. They carry the weight of all the years between the moment they should have been said and the moment they actually arrived. But they are not nothing. I am learning to receive them as what they are. An imperfect but genuine attempt by an imperfect person to cross a distance that was never supposed to exist. I still have the document I wrote the night of the reunion. 1 line at the top of an otherwise blank page. Build it until there is no argument left to make. I opened it again last week. I did not add anything to it. It does not need anything added. It said exactly what it needed to say at exactly the moment I needed to hear it, and it has been true every day since. That is what I want to leave you with, not the contract number or the office or the industry recognition. The sentence, the one you write for yourself, alone, after the worst night, and then wake up the next morning and go live. If you made it all the way here, thank you. If this story found you somewhere you recognize, hold on to it. And know that the people who write you off the loudest are usually the ones most unprepared for what you're quietly becoming. Let them be unprepared. Keep building. The room where the truth finally shows up will be worth every single quiet morning you spent getting there. The lesson this story carries. What happened to Nora is not rare. The specifics are hers. The backyard in Brentwood, the 30 relatives, the 4 words she said on her way out. But the core of it is something that happens in families everywhere in 100 different forms. A parent decides what a child is worth before the child has had a chance to demonstrate it. and then defends that decision long past the point where the evidence has turned against it. Frank Calloway was not a monster. He was a man who confused his metrics for the only metrics, who measured worth in credentials because credentials had been the measure of his own working life, and who never thought to ask whether his daughter might be building something real in a direction he hadn't thought to look. That is a human failure, a common one. It does not make it less painful for the person on the receiving end of it. The lesson is not succeed, and they'll be sorry. Success as revenge is a hollow project. It puts other people at the center of your motivation and means you are always building toward their reaction rather than toward something real. Nora's lesson is different and more durable. Build what is true. Build in the direction your actual talent points. Build with the standards you set for yourself rather than the ones other people have set for you. Do it quietly if you need to. Do it in the dark if that is what the season requires. The truth about what you've built will eventually show up in rooms you didn't plan for, carrying your name, speaking for itself. That is not revenge. That is consequence. It is slower than revenge, and it is permanent in a way that revenge never is. How to apply this to your own life? If you have been publicly dismissed by someone whose opinion you were supposed to be able to count on, I want to say this to you as directly as I can. Their assessment is not the final word. It is not even a reliable draft. It is one person's limited view, formed from a limited position, of something they have not taken the time to look at carefully. You are not required to accept it as accurate. You are not required to spend your energy arguing against it in real time. The most powerful response to being underestimated, particularly in public, particularly in front of people who matter to you, is not the comeback you deliver in the moment. It is the life you build in the months and years that follow, quietly with your hands in the direction of what is actually true about you. Build in private if you need to. There is wisdom in keeping your work away from eyes that have already decided what they'll find. Some things need to be solid before they can withstand being seen. Protect the process until the product is strong enough to protect itself. And when you are tempted to announce something before it's finished, to prove something to someone who hurt you, ask yourself whether you are building for them or for the work. The answer to that question will tell you everything about whether you should speak yet. Find the Uncle Gene in your life. Find the person at the edge of every gathering who has always been paying the right kind of attention, who asks what you actually want rather than what you're going to do about failing to be what someone else expected. Hold on to that person. Call them on Sundays. Tell them what you're building. They already believe in you. They just need you to believe in yourself long enough to show them they were right. They were. You already know what you're capable of. The only remaining question is how long you're willing to spend making it visible. Start now. The fireflies are already out.